It is with great pleasure that we introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Audrey Lee, who is the Director of Energy Strategy at Microsoft. Dr. Lee stands at the forefront of pioneering a resilient and sustainable cloud, harnessing her extensive expertise to lead Microsoft's data center energy team in global technology and infrastructure strategies. As a board member of several influential organizations, including Redaptive Inc., Linux Foundation Energy, and Clean Energy for America's Education Fund, she brings a wealth of knowledge in deploying energy solutions and advocating for energy strategies in the US. Her academic background is equally impressive. She holds a PhD in electrical engineering from Princeton University and a BS in applied physics from the California Institute of Technology. Driving our conversation is one of my favorite professors here at Fuqua, Dr. Dan Vermeer. Dan Vermeer is the Executive Director of the Center of Energy Development and the Global Environment, and he's an Associate Professor of the Practice here at Duke University's Fuqua School of Business. Together, they will explore the interconnections between the themes of technology, policy, and finance discussed throughout today's conference. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Audrey Lee and Dr. Dan Vermeer to the stage.
All right, excellent. Well, welcome, Audrey. It's great to have you here, and thank you guys for sticking it out. A lot of your less committed colleagues have already left, but it's awesome to see that we actually have people up in the top section. I know by the last session of the day, sometimes it gets a little thin out there. So I know there's a lot of interest in this conversation. I'm really excited to have Audrey Lee here from Microsoft. For a long time, I've been really fascinated and impressed with the role that Microsoft has played out of maybe its core business, but with a recognition of just how important energy is to what it does and what the world tries to do. So the themes that I have picked up over the course of today and over the last several days of conversations here at Duke, one is around the disruptive force of new technologies. And it's really clear. We've talked a lot about that. Eric Toon's conversation and Mark's comments earlier today talked about the suite of new technologies and what they can deliver for us. The other theme that I've heard consistently woven through the conversation is around energy equity and social justice and the ways that energy is really intimately interconnected with those kinds of issues. And third, which I've heard, but maybe a little bit less emphasis, and I hope we can unpack today, is the role of the energy consumer. Because if you think about it, new technologies have to be purchased by somebody. Somebody needs to adopt them. Somebody needs to get over the status quo, the existing solutions, and adopt something new where there's risk, there may be pain involved in that process. And you have a lot of experience over the course of your career in unpacking the consumer value proposition. How do you get people to do something new in this space? And so I'd like to start the conversation today by just asking you to give a little bit of a drive-by tour of your career. You've played roles in public policy, in large companies, as an advisor to small companies. You've been really across lots of different parts of this landscape. So I thought it would be helpful for you to just share a little bit about that trip and especially the transitions, how you made those transitions and why.
Yeah, happy to. And thank you so much for inviting me. This is such an honor. I love going to student-run energy conferences. The last one I went to was at MIT, and out of that I met someone from SK, the Korean conglomerate, and that ended up being a joint venture with Sunrun and a company called Lunar that launched. So you never know. Just really great conversations that I've had at student-run energy conferences. I guess in my career, so my PhD is in electrical engineering. I hated it. I hated being in a dark lab, working with liquid helium and aligning lasers and giant magnets. And that's where I discovered public policy at Princeton and the public policy school there, and just loved the social, we talked a lot about, advice to students and just the social impact that public policy can make. And I've loved my time. I was at the Department of Energy. That was my first job out of graduate school. Really loved that system level analysis. Like, how do we solve these big problems? And what is the role of policy to do that? I always thought of it as policy is making the rules of the game, and the private markets are kind of players in the game. And I've loved being on both sides of that. The impact that you can have with policy and creating markets and influencing markets. But then the creativity and the innovation and the ingenuity in terms of not just technologies, but business models on the private sector side to solve those problems. I mean, the transition, and then I spent some time in the California Public Utilities Commission, really big impact that state public utilities commissions, because we have regulated monopolies for our utilities to run our electricity grid, the impact that public utility commissions can make on that. And especially in a place like California where I was working, the push that you can make on public policy in terms of climate change is really large. I'd say the transition, though, from policy to the private sector side was a little bit tough. I think most people who come from policy go into the private sector, go into government affairs or regulatory affairs. And so to want to do something like business development or product management, took some convincing. I did that at a startup. I found that being at a startup where you can play many roles and wear many hats, and really was able to prove myself, as opposed to a larger organization where there are more defined roles. I thought that worked for me. It's not, everyone has their own path. And it was just really fun to be at a startup and to just create and build. My team worked on building a software platform for designing and optimizing batteries. And at that time, was it 2014? Energy storage and lithium-ion batteries were really, hitting that cost curve, cost reduction, and it was amazing. Even for my time at DOE, when I was at DOE, it was like 2006 to 2010. Electric vehicles were a fantasy. This holy grail of having a place to store energy because supply and demand is instantaneous. And so to be able to finally see that was really exciting. And what could you do for the grid and energy storage has been very exciting to continue to see that, especially with players like Fluence and some of the other panelists working on energy storage. Sorry, let me speed this up. And then I had the opportunity. So the startup I worked at was on the commercial and industrial side, and it was using batteries and aggregating them into virtual power plants to replace natural gas peaker plants. So in Southern California, the San Onofre nuclear generating station had just been closed down. There was a 2.2 gigawatt capacity gap in the Southern California area, which is a very urban area. And so we were installing batteries at office parks and big box stores and university campuses, and aggregating them and providing the capacity needed to replace that capacity and avoid building new peaker power plants. And then I had the opportunity to do that on the residential side at Sunrun. I think there's a mention about creative financing sounds bad when you say creative, but the opportunity to develop financing tools like power purchase agreements to allow residential customers to adopt rooftop solar. And when I got there, really expanding that to also include battery storage for resiliency reasons, but also to work with the utility and to be able to aggregate those systems across hundreds of households and provide a resource back to the grid as well, and in the same way replace the need for peaker plants. And so we were able to bid capacity 20 megawatts into the ISO New England market, which is the first time a customer-sited resource was able to do that. So that was lots of fun. And then I just didn't know what I wanted to do next, and was interested. I've always really loved infrastructure, and that's why I like energy, because it's just so foundational to society. And how do we do that in a sustainable way? And I wanted to learn about the cloud. I wanted to learn about data centers and that intersection. If you think about what's in a data center, it's silicon and electricity, basically. And so how do we, and it's such an underlying fabric of society today. And so how do we do that in a sustainable manner? To continue to grow that capability and what that computing capability does for the clean energy industry as well is really important. So that's how I got here.
Awesome.
Sorry, that was too long-winded.
Well, to fast forward to the present, at Microsoft, you're the head of energy strategy. And so what does that mean to Microsoft, and especially For the company as a whole, when they think about energy, what role does it play in helping it achieve its strategy?
Yeah, I'd say as I just mentioned, it's really important. You need electricity for data centers, and that's a large part of Microsoft's business. We still do Office and Windows, but a lot of that is on the cloud. And we serve Fortune 500 companies with enterprise workloads on the cloud as well. And really I think strategy is really looking out longer term, and because energy is so infrastructure dependent. As Eric said, it's actual steel in the ground. How do we ensure that we're planning appropriately 5, 7, 10 years down the line to ensure that sustained data center growth based on sustainable energy infrastructure? And so that's a mixture of different. This role was new. It was sort of created when I joined Microsoft. But it's technology strategy. So what are we doing to invest in new technologies that will help us operate sustainably, but also have an intersection with our business as well. So we have a $1 billion climate innovation fund that I work closely with to look at their investment strategy and how we invest in new technologies. And it spans a wide variety. Technology strategy, our commercial strategy, there's actually a lot of synergy and intersection between we're some of the largest customers of many utilities across the world, but utilities are also customers of Microsoft, and how do we help them digitize their systems and bring technology into their electricity systems to help them decarbonize faster as well. Let's see. Technology, commercial, resilience, energy resilience, how do we make our grid more reliable? And then there's also like regulatory and policy strategy kind of weaved in there. And so how do we partner with utilities and regulators in order to get this infrastructure? I mean, this is the question that is facing us all, is like, what is this transition that we need to make? The 10 trillion that Elaine just said that's needed in the US at least to invest in infrastructure to truly decarbonize and become net zero.
Good. So a lot of students that I talk to, I think, are trying to figure out what technology, what part of industry do they focus on? Should they be in the solar industry or offshore wind? And your career is very interesting because you haven't really defined yourself in terms of a particular technology, but more in terms of systems. Mm-hmm. And I'd be interested in you telling us a little bit about your approach to energy and why a systems lens is really useful for thinking about where to intervene.
Yeah, and I think that was a reaction to doing my PhD on something. My PhD was on like quantum dots and quantum computing. It was super narrow, like 10 people. I mean, now there's startups on quantum computing, but back then it was quite narrow. And so when I got to the Department of Energy and I got to work on system modeling, I just loved zooming out and really having this bird's eye view of the entire energy system, of the entire US energy system, and globally too. We were working a lot on biofuels and oil markets back then. But to be able to see the entire energy system, and not only to see like near term, but also how do you, back then we were planning out to 2030 and 2050, so looking out decades, and really being able to see it from a system perspective, you see that you need all of it. And I think the pitfall that working on like the distributed solar side is you get in these unnecessary and artificial debates about, should we be doing utility scale versus distributed? It's like the problem is so hard, we need everything. And so looking at it from a system, how do all of these technologies come together to make an operating electricity grid? And what are the right timescales, right? We need to be investing longer term. I did a fellowship at Harvard where we're looking really, how do we invest in that research and development in the long-term technologies? And then how do we leverage and go as fast as we can, invest as much as we can in the technologies that we have in our hand today, like solar, wind, and batteries, but then also be investing in fusion and continuing our efforts to try to expand nuclear, all zero carbon-free technologies. I think just keeping your eye on all of it. I've enjoyed, from a policy perspective, kind of having that broader perspective. I think, but I've also enjoyed being at a startup and digging into one technology like battery storage and figuring out how we can leverage that and solve important key problems to do that. You have a long career ahead of you. Do all of it. Do multiple things. It's worked for me.
I'd like to just double click on the Sunrun experience, because Sunrun is a company that went from being a solar provider to a much more integrated solutions developer for residential customers. And I'm interested in what you saw sort of in the evolution of that company and whether it's working or not, because it strikes me as really intriguing, but also a tough sell.
It's really hard. I think we as a society recognized in the early days in Clean Tech Transition 1.0, it's like, hey, let's deploy the solar contribution to the grid mix was so small. It's like, let's just do as much as we can. But there's mention of the duck curve, and we've reached a point where solar has penetrated quite a lot, and now how do we integrate it with other technologies into the grid so that we can really fully reach 100% decarbonization of our electricity grid? And so I think there's just general recognition that you can't operate on the sidelines, trying to do net energy metering and just keep deploying solar without thinking about how you're impacting the grid. As you penetrate more and gain more market share, how do you work with most of us operate on the grid. How do we work with the utilities? How do we make the grid more reliable and more sustainable? And so that was kind of the birth of the group that I started at Sunrun, the Grid Services, the Energy Services group, which was looking at we're deploying the solar, we're deploying these batteries for backup, because of wildfires, for example, in California and public safety power shutoffs. Really a lot of adoption of batteries for backup needs for homes, but how do we go further and aggregate these batteries, and as I described before, build these virtual power plants? How do we work with utilities? Traditionally, I think solar companies and utilities have been fighting over net energy metering, but that's not helping us, right, to have those fights. How do we actually work together to bring more stability and more clean energy to the grid? So it was a great opportunity to do that, and we negotiated a lot of contracts with utilities and CCAs to do that. But it's hard. it's very hard because and some of the surprising learnings, just fixing how you sell storage to customers, right? If a salesperson is not confident in in a new technology like batteries, they're not going to sell it because they're not going to risk that sale. And so training your salespeople properly. The installation of a battery takes longer than it does for solar, or it can, and so incentivizing the installers to do that. The permitting, working with the utilities on interconnection of a new technology, all these things have to be solved, and that's kind of the day-to-day of it, and there's just important work to do there.
So 5 years ago, utilities were concerned about the death spiral of decreasing demand, but we're not in that world anymore. You cited some pretty amazing statistics when we were preparing for this session about what you see happening to aggregate demand given the advent of EVs and other things that are driving energy demand. I'd be interested to share some of that thinking and how it impacts what you're doing at Microsoft.
Yeah, I would not have predicted this several years ago in my career. Just that we've had decades of, relatively low, non-existent growth in electricity demand, especially in a place like the U.S. A lot of offshoring and going to a service industry and loss of manufacturing, and all of a sudden now, what we're seeing is this increased electricity demand. I don't know if you probably haven't, but we have a presence in Georgia. So Georgia Power just refiled their integrated resource plan. And I think they have updated their projections for load growth, and it's 17 times what they forecasted just a few years ago. And a lot of that is, we've talked about in the panels before, and a lot of it is clean manufacturing coming back to the US because of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a great thing. But with that manufacturing comes with a lot of electricity demand. Of course, electrification of transportation and buildings requiring, I think Eric Toon said 4x the infrastructure need. And then, of course, also data centers. So you may be seeing it's very more public. In Virginia, there's a lot of data center presence there, and work with Dominion. I think in January, Dominion had published their reforecast, and they project that in 10 years, their demand, 50% of their demand will be from data centers. And that's pretty much all the growth. So their demand will double, and that increase is data centers. Mm-hmm. And so, we find ourselves, how do we build infrastructure quickly? How do we put steel in the ground quickly? And that really has to be a collaboration between utilities and customers and regulators and voters, the policy side of it. And I think just that historical model where, you're a customer, you just, hey, utility, I need electricity, interconnect me. You sell me electricity, and the utility was happy to provide that to you. Really, it has to be much more of a partnership. Like, how do we both figure this out in order to do this more sustainably? A lot of state in North Carolina have policies for net zero on their utilities, and so we're all trying to put our heads together to figure out how we do this and incorporate new technologies into that.
Yeah. So I'm interested in your thoughts on financing. The government in the U.S. has played now a big hand in creating certain kinds of finance. Microsoft itself is a funder on the innovation side as well. So how do you see that world of finance to support the build out of this totally new infrastructure, and where are the gaps in that?
I could speak from my personal experience. Well, first Microsoft. So I mentioned the Climate Innovation Fund, really looking at where is there a gap in financing that a corporate strategic VC fund could step in and help with that. So the Climate Innovation Fund, I said, is $1 billion. It's kind of reaching its end at this point. TBD what will happen next. But we're always a follower. We never lead an investment. And we're really looking at opportunities to make our operations more sustainable, or there's a commercial opportunity for us where we can commercialize a tool and then make that available to the wider economy to become more sustainable. I think there's a good question about what is the role of the corporate in this, right? If utilities are operating as regulated monopolies, they have responsibilities to their shareholders and their ratepayers. Rising costs of infrastructure investment, how much of that should be borne on the backs of ratepayers? How do we pay our fair share for the electricity that we're using? And if we want that to be zero carbon, how are we paying for that premium so that other ratepayers aren't responsible for that? So, how do we create new structures to allow that growth and really allocate costs fairly? I think is an important a piece of that. In terms of other, so there's the financing, and then and I think related to financing is who is holding certain risks, right? There's technology risk, and maybe it's more appropriate for certain types of investors to hold different kinds of risk because they have the ability to. Government, holding certain types of risk as well. Maybe backstop, construction delay risk. So I think those things, there's a lot of opportunity. I don't have all the answers, but I think there's a lot of opportunity to think about, well, what is the role of a corporate in making these investments that's appropriate for corporates versus governments versus utilities versus ratepayers and shareholders of utilities as well.
I'd love to learn more about your engagement in policy advocacy. How do you work at the level of the state, at the level of the country, in the US and elsewhere in terms of advocating for policies that are in your interest, but also that you see as sort of collectively needed?
Yeah, I think from the Microsoft perspective, and when it comes to sustainability and decarbonization, there's our footprint, but really it would just be easier if the whole economy was decarbonized, if grids were all decarbonized, and then we wouldn't have to worry about procuring more PPAs and buying solar and wind and other resources to offset it. And so really that advocacy is policy advocacy to get us there, to not just decarbonize our footprint, not just to decarbonize our footprint, but to decarbonize just the grid everywhere, right? It's all one atmosphere that we're breathing from and affected by climate change. And so that's been our position. And it's also just really important for us to have a social license to operate. Our data centers and their sustainability is another company's Scope 3 emissions because they're using our data centers. And so just to serve our customers, to be, data centers aren't actually in the cloud, they're physical buildings, and to operate in the communities that we operate in, it's very important for us to be sustainable. And it's, our responsibility to the communities and to Earth, frankly. So I think that's kind of the advocacy. I think in terms of, we do operate at multiple government levels and the the city, permitting, state, country, regional level. I don't know, is there a more specific question?
Well, maybe you can give us some examples of the kind of differences in different markets where you operate, either from a policy perspective or what it takes to secure that social license to operate in different places. I think it'd be helpful just to get a little flavor. You're not just stamping out data centers in each of these places. You really have to build a local relationship, network, and a set of kind of enablers to make those things happen. So.
I mean, we have, I think, over 200 data centers around the world. So presence in the Americas, North and South America, Central as well, and then Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and then as well as in Asia Pacific. And there's just such a variety. I mean, in Europe, you have, unfortunately, given the current Ukraine war, higher energy prices, but also more motivation to adopt sustainable energy. In Asia Pacific, I think it's, the power purchase agreement market for renewables is less developed in certain countries. You also have land constraints in certain island countries as well. Some of the utilities are national entities, and so not as much deregulation of the market. And so just very different challenges. And then I think also as you look to not just our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, so Scope 1 is our direct emissions from our operations, and then Scope 2 is electricity, but also Scope 3. So we have a goal to be carbon negative across Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions by 2030. And so Scope 3 includes upstream emissions of everything that goes into our business, so that the biggest portions, and this is all in our sustainability report, the biggest portions are semiconductor manufacturing, so all of the servers and racks that go into data centers or Xbox and Surface computers. And then materials like cement and steel that go into our data centers. And then downstream is the electricity used by our customers on our products. So people playing Xbox in their homes, that electricity consumption is our Scope 3 as well. So procuring renewable energy credits to offset that. But a lot of the manufacturing of that upstream supply chain is in places that have more carbon-intensive grids. It's a large challenge, but I think it's an opportunity for us to have a lot of reach and impact across the economy, and hoping that our policies then have this ripple effect to other companies. And so we've instituted a carbon fee. We have an internal carbon fee that we've had since 2012, but we've also instituted one for our supply chain. And getting that transparency in our supply chain is really important.
I had an interesting conversation with the director for water in Microsoft several years ago, and she told me an interesting story of building out data centers in different parts of the US. You do a risk assessment, see about adequacy of water and supportive policy environment and all the things that you need to address. And then you'd end up going to that community to build a data center and realize there's 9 other companies that are building data centers in that same place. So I'm just wondering, that creates two problems. One is this sort of pile-on effect of places that may have adequate resources for some level of economic development, but maybe not to have everybody come there at the same time. It also leaves a lot of places out that didn't get that data center, doesn't get the tax benefits, the jobs, whatever might come with that. So I'm just interested in how you sort of think through that siting process and that risk assessment process to try to avoid some of those kind of far ends of the extreme. How do you get these data centers placed in a way that is sustainable in those local communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to your policy question. I think we collaborate with our tech company peers on policy a lot because we all want to see a carbon-free grid, decarbonized grid, and want to see investment. And there's a lot of opportunity to collaborate on especially on the state level regulatory and federal regulatory policies to do that. I think there's the ECA, Electricity Consumers Alliance. So large electricity customers coming together to make the investments we want a reliable grid and we want a sustainable grid. And I think we're very much aligned in that, right? It's not like one person can build a transmission line. You all come together and use that transmission line together and want those investments together. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity there to coordinate better on that. I mean, you mentioned water. It's a very interesting trade-off in water. and energy, just, there's a lot of nexus on that, but within a data center as well, being really conscious of how we're cooling that data center. Are we using water? Are we using air? And how do we, being sensitive to the natural resources in a particular area. We design our data centers differently to be sensitive to that.
Mm-hmm. Good. You were a co-author of a paper recently on women in the renewable energy industry. So I'm interested in your thoughts about where I guess you're kind of part of the technology industry and also part of the energy industry at the same time, but in those industries that you're really familiar with, where are we in that process of trying to make it a healthy, positive environment for women and people of color?
No, I'm just trying to think what story to talk about. I mean, I'm just looking across this room, and it's great to see how diverse and inclusive, and just the number of people in this room that are passionate, I assume passionate about energy, and here till 4 o'clock on this. I think. When there was in the previous panels, I think there was talk about like when they were in grad school. Like, well, when I was in grad school, there was only one professor with one project on clean energy on like photovoltaic. I was in electrical engineering, so it was on silicon photovoltaic cells. And just now, like just to see, the number of careers and the number of people interested in working on clean energy it gives me so much hope compared to where we were a long time, 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, 20 years ago. And so that gives me a lot of hope. I think, I really appreciate the culture at Microsoft and how diverse and inclusive it is and how collaborative it is. And it's, we have, Satya, our CEO, talks a lot about a growth mindset and being, not closed, but really that curiosity and learning and collaboration. It's performance evaluation season right now, and we have, in our performance evaluation, I just finished mine today, we're really rated on impact, but impact is measured in 3 ways. It's measured, your own contribution to impact for the company, what you have done, but then it's also equally measured by how you contributed to someone else's impact. And then the third one is how you leveraged other people's work to make impact yourself. And so just that really creates a much more inclusive culture at Microsoft and working across teams. So I've really enjoyed that. I think that's really important in finding a good place to work.
I have so many more questions, but I think we should maybe open it up to questions from all of you.
So we have one question and another one that's very similar, so I'll just read off both. Sure. Should we be talking about data efficiency with regard to energy consumption? Is data so cheap right now that we have no incentive to be data efficient? And then a follow-on question. Large language models may not be sentient, but they are energy hogs. How much has the use and growth of ChatGPT impacted Microsoft's estimates for energy demand?
Good, very good questions. Yeah, I think we definitely should be, and I think that is slowly being incorporated into. I think previously, as we were building data centers, like energy wasn't the most, wasn't at the top of the list in terms of how we site them and how we build them. In terms of how we build them, we've had 8 generations of data center design and continue to make them more efficient. And energy cost savings are really important. But in terms of where we site them and grids being more limited in our ability to grow data centers, so I think that's coming. In terms of, and to me, that's the purpose of markets, right? To price things better. And I think that historically may not have been priced well, but I think going forward, there's real opportunity there. The second question was on AI and ChatGPT. Yes, there's been a lot of cloud growth, and then that growth, and then on top of that AI growth will be significant. But I think there's also a lot of opportunities in terms of, and it's still to be seen and actively explored. And it came up in the last the 2 panels before. But I think there's also a lot of opportunity for AI to help with this clean energy transition. In terms of fusion, using AI models to understand different ways to do fusion or battery, exploring different battery chemistries. Not an expert in this area, but I think there's a lot of opportunity to leverage AI. And I think it's up to us to figure out how to do that.
Speaking further, I guess, on the concept of fusion, if you could speak to this, what made Microsoft choose Helion over other fusion tech companies to partner with? And are you planning on working with other companies in that space?
Yeah. So sorry, I want to add one more thing on the AI question before. I mean, I think that also pushes us, because of the larger energy consumption, that really pushes us, as I said in the beginning, like, we just need to decarbonize our grids. We need to be working to make that energy that we're using decarbonize, and how do we invest in technology and infrastructure investments to do that. In terms of Helion, and so we signed a power purchase agreement with Helion and Constellation for fusion, and I think it's part of that. It's part of, like, what is that corporate role to provide that demand pool for new technologies, right? I think that is one, potential valuable role of corporate offtake in energy, is to provide that demand pool. You have these technologies, but they need to see that market signal for them. And so that was part of the intent, is like, how do we do that? And how do we, and I think we want to do more of that, as one is not enough, obviously. How do we do more? And not just in fusion, but also in other technologies as well. And we've talked a lot about the technologies here, but what is that, and the system view of things, and what is that full suite of technologies where we need that market pool and provide that price signal for new technologies.
Thank you. So you talked a little bit about some of your investments in various communities. How does Microsoft lead or consider opening up more clean energy jobs?
I mean, you had mentioned a little bit about equity, and I think we have quite an active group working on environmental justice. So one example, and we've posted kind of our learnings on this. So one example is we're out there doing a lot of power purchase agreements for solar and wind, and there's an opportunity, as we do that corporate procurement, to add a rider, which then, and Elaine talked about community development benefits, to create community funds, and really important part of that is allowing communities that have been disproportionately affected, that will be disproportionately affected by climate change and energy infrastructure build out, to allow them to decide how those funds are used, whether it is for workforce development, or whether it is for better energy efficiency to reduce the energy costs. In low and moderate income communities, energy costs can be a significant portion of their budgets, and so how can those funds be used to make investments in efficiency and clean energy? So that's some of the things we're doing. I mean, our energy team we have, like, I think we're at 100 people on the data center energy team. So just the growth of the data centers. How do we create more energy jobs? I think our role at Microsoft. Also on the digital side and selling digital services to Fortune 500 companies and to energy companies, I think is really important, and in the growth of that energy sector.
Yeah, we've got a lot of great ones. Another is, what role do carbon offsets play in Microsoft's energy strategy, and how does Microsoft work to ensure the additionality and integrity of the offsets that it does buy?
Yeah, we have a great team on carbon dioxide removal. So Microsoft has a goal that by 2050, I talked about our 2030 goal, but by 2050, we will remove all of our historical emissions back to the founding of the company in 1975. And so it's kind of hard to do that operationally because it's already been emitted in the atmosphere. And so carbon dioxide removal is a really important part of our plan to meet that goal. So that team is kind of divided up in terms of shorter duration and longer duration. So shorter duration offsets shorter duration carbon dioxide removal is more nature-based solutions, so like forestry, and then longer duration, like direct air capture, where we're sequestering the CO2 underground. And the challenge, I think, is we need so much carbon dioxide removal, and the markets and the technologies are still developing. And so not only are we trying to create ways for us, not only are we trying to procure that carbon dioxide removal, but how do we actually create those markets? So our Climate Innovation Fund is investing in some of those technologies, and our capital can be, and this is the other role, our capital can be quite flexible on the Climate Innovation Fund side. It can be Series A through Series E, it can be debt, equity. So using that flexibility to invest in whatever is needed to get these projects going and create the supply, because Microsoft is, one of a few companies taking that first step, but of course we want all companies to start procuring this and offsetting their emissions.
Mm-hmm.
One more, and then we'll pass it to you just maybe for some closing remarks or insights. So there are sort of two that go together. What expectations do you have from Microsoft's own load growth in the future, and what technologies are you excited about in meeting those demands, and then the risks that you see that go along with those technologies?
It's a lot. I can't really say how much our load growth is. I mean, you can look at our earnings call and you can see that cloud revenue growth has grown at 20 to 30% per year. And so if you extrapolate that out 10 years, it's a lot. And you think about how much you use the cloud yourself, and then you add AI on top of that. And so it's a big challenge. But I am hopeful because it's a challenge that we have to solve anyway, which is this clean energy infrastructure build-out challenge, right? Before, it was just how do we replace this infrastructure to make it cleaner, sort of the clean tech transition 1.0. But now, because of this load growth, it's replacing that and building new. And so as we're trying to build new to support this growth, we have to figure out how to clean the entire economy for decarbonization. And so I'm hopeful that we do figure that out. And you have, because so many industries and the economy depends on it, you have so many people, and you have all of you working on this. In terms of, what was the last one, technologies?
Sure, if you have time, or closing remarks.
I have one more question to ask before we wrap. We've asked many of the panelists about their advice for careers, so check, that's covered. I'm interested in how you stay sane and healthy working in this area. It's a turbulent space. There's lots of highs, but there's lots of lows, and it's a super daunting challenge. So what do you do to stay safe, healthy, and sane in this kind of environment?
Let's see. I have I have kids. I have a 10-year-old and a 13-year-old, so they keep me pretty busy, and it's fun. It is nice to be able to kind of tune out work for a bit and kind of be in their world and their play and their curiosity of the world. I think helps me back to that wonder you have as a child about how the questions my son asks about how the world works, and really think to not get bogged down with how hard this challenge is. But well, why can't we do it a different way? Why can't we try things? Why can't we have a different business model? Why can't we? It's really fun to see all the different technology companies on panels. Why can't we have a different approach to solving this hard problem? So I think it's my kids that help me.
Awesome. I like that spirit of curiosity. Audrey, great to have you here. Really fascinating conversation, and I appreciate you being part of the Duke conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Audrey, going ahead.